I'm making sure to record this presentation. And now I need to end the show so I can get my Zoom window back up. Oh my gosh, technology, gotta love it. Oh yes, I see the question in the chat box there. Yes, the announcement I sent said 2.5 proposed CEUs. They are in fact approved now. So we are, you are eligible for 2.5 CEUs at this presentation. So let me get back to sharing. Okay, so I'm going to ask Kim or Gundy just to make sure you can see this title slide on this presentation, correct? And you might be muted.
Yeah,
I can now. It disappeared for a second, but I see it now.
Okay, I think the switching between share screen versus just the webcam is just like there's like a second or two delay there. Okay, so moving along. So the outline of this presentation today is I'm going to sort of introduce what is an invasive species. Then I'm going to sort of outline what the effects are non-native species on Florida's native ecosystems. And I'm saying non-native because I'm being a little bit broader than just what's considered an invasive species. And then I'm going to talk about give some examples where land management actions might promote invasion by non-native species. And also talk about how those non-native species feed back into the land management actions you have to do. I'll briefly talk about what I'd call a cryptic invasion and just give a quick conclusion. So as opposed to defining what is an invasive species, maybe it's better to say what is not an invasive species. So let's talk about our native species. Some of these are what I call nice species, like American beautyberry. Let me get my little laser pointer, like American beautyberry right here, which has good wildlife and horticultural value, or pine lily here. You know, these are what I call nice species. And then you can have what I call managed species, like cattails. If you're way out in the middle of a natural area and you got cattails at the edge of like a little natural water body, and you know, that's fine. But the native cattails can also cause you a problem if you work for, say, the water management district and you got cattails, you know, really encroaching in on the filter marsh or a, you know, water treatment area. Like you need to have a certain amount of water flow, but cattails are going crazy due to the increased nutrients. So even though species has to be managed, it's aggressive, it's spreading rapidly. We don't want to call that invasive species because really truly invasives, sort of by definition, are going to be our non-native species. Now we also have some non-native, non-invasive species, and these can be like horticultural species purposely introduced for ornament, say like crepe myrtle and yellow tab here. All right, I personally have seen crepe myrtle seedlings in a long unburned upland pine sandhill area down at Chinsegat Natural Area that Hernando County manages. But it was not, you know, that crepe myrtle, yeah, I found a few seedlings in there, but it wasn't exactly like rampant by any means. Also, agricultural species like tomato and corn, they're not native, but we don't think of them as being invasive in Florida. And we have some accidental introductions. Actually, we have many accidental introductions, but a lot of them aren't necessarily invasive. So I think what really is a Florida invasive species is it has to be non-native, and that means the plant evolved outside of Florida, like it's native to some other ecosystem outside the state of Florida, whether it's Asia, Europe, Africa. It could even be the Western US. It could be the Mississippi River Valley. It's just not from Florida. And it's colonized in Florida. It got here. It's been introduced somehow, whether by its own means, by animal or by human, and it's spread beyond its introduction site in Florida. And it's invading relatively intact ecosystems. And it's locally reducing biodiversity or alters the ecosystems here. And I'm going to go through some examples of like how I think, like some good examples of this. One thing I want to point out here is recently there was a publication by a bunch of folks from IFAS and some of their colleagues at other universities. I just kind of want you to take note of this. It's invasive species terminology, standardizing for stakeholder education. Some of the old terminology that you've seen in some invasive plant workshops, some of that terminology is getting phased out, like invasive exotic. Folks are trying to get rid of the word exotic from the terminology of invasive species management, because there's been several social studies been done where the word exotic, although to folks like us, we know that means it's from somewhere else and it's potentially a problem. To the general public, exotic is a wonderful thing, because don't you want to vacation in exotic locales? Don't you want to eat exotic food? Hey, the general public sounds like they may want exotic plants because it can make their yard look exotic. So they're trying to get rid of that terminology, whereas invasive, it's hard to imagine the general public wants to stay with, wants to plant anything that sounds invasive, and there's some other terminology that's getting sort of, I'd say, simplified, so this is a good publication to check out, and you can find it online for free. It's in a, open access journal. So are all non-native species bad here in Florida? Well, it depends on what their effects are. And those effects can be no effect whatsoever, and they simply coexist with our native species. I'd say the next level effect is that it displaces a native species, or maybe displaces one or two species, typically close relatives. Then it gets to where it displaces sort of many species, where it's really decreasing biodiversity. And then I would say the most severe effect is it's just they're having such effects on so many species at once. They're actually sort of doing what we call ecosystem engineering, where it's completely altering the function of the ecosystem. So my question here is, which of the above effects likely correlate with that? Well, it used to be FLEPC, now it's the FISC category 1 and 2 ranks. It's really this sort of 3 and 4 here. These effects are what sort of give the category 1 and 2 ranks here. And so let's go through some of these examples. I was asked years ago, can you think of a non-native plant that's actually entered ecosystems but doesn't really have an impact? And
doing okay.
Actually, hold on, we got someone not muted on a phone call here. I think Kim or Gundy, you can actually mute that person if you need to.
Yeah, I think I muted them.
Okay. All right. So one example I thought of was this southern rock bell. It's Wallenbergia marginata. It's actually a close relative of our Native American campanula. I remember seeing this in upland pine and sandhills when I worked at Tall Timbers. I found it in with wiregrass and all the other nice native upland pine sandhill species. But it never seemed to be displacing anything, just seems to fit in right with this nice ground, this really diverse ground cover. It seems to be okay with frequent prescribed fire. So it's non-native. It evolved outside of Florida. It colonized Florida, has spread pretty well across the state, the northern 2/3. It's invading relatively intact ecosystems, but it looks to me like it's not really reducing biodiversity or alters ecosystems. The only impact I could see it had is if there's a disease of this plant that it's pretty tolerant of, but it jumps onto our native close relatives. That could be an issue, but I don't believe that's happening with this plant. But here's an example of a non-native invading ecosystems, but not really apparently having any impact. So two, the second effect is displaces a native species. And here we go, salt marsh cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora. Now, for you botanists out there who know your Florida plants, you're like, well, wait, this is native. This is a Florida native. And in fact, it is. So another thing I like to do in this workshop is, so many of these workshops we do, it's always focusing on what plant is impacting Florida, like what this non-native plant to Florida, that non-native plant. I actually like to show how some Florida natives made it elsewhere and are impacting that. So again, this is our dominant salt marsh cordgrass, native to the US Atlantic and Gulf Coast. It goes all the way from like Newfoundland, I think, even down through the Caribbean and maybe even to Central and South America. Very widespread on our East Coast. Well, it got introduced purposely onto the West Coast of the US. Corps of Engineers introduced it out there to help minimize erosion of some California bays. And lo and behold, it hybridized with the rare native California smooth cordgrass, and it created hybrids. Because salt marsh cordgrass is such an aggressive invasive, it is actually vegetatively outcompeting the smooth cordgrass, and it's also hybridizing the native out. In addition to this one hybridizing with this one directly, the hybrids are producing pollen that feed back into this. So the smooth cordgrass is getting hammered both vegetatively and reproductively by this species. Oh, and lo and behold, our salt marsh cordgrass accidentally made it to the United Kingdom, probably through ballast and sailing ships, a century or two ago. And it hybridized with the native small cordgrass, Spartina marittima. In that case, it created a sterile hybrid because the chromosome numbers differ between these two, so they couldn't sexually reproduce. It can only vegetatively spread, which could still be a massive problem. But the sterile hybrid underwent a chromosome doubling, and can't really explain it here, but basically, if you have a sterile hybrid due to mismatched chromosome number between the two parent species, anytime you have a chromosome doubling, that chromosome mismatch is fixed, and now you have a fertile tetraploid hybrid. And this is what they call English cordgrass, and it's really fertile. It's vegetatively aggressive, and it itself is now a new invasive species because from the UK, it's made it to Asia, Australia, New Zealand, North America, South Africa, and the western coast of the US. In fact, this English cordgrass is now competing against smooth cordgrass with our native salt marsh cordgrass and the hybrids of these two. So this poor smooth cordgrass is just getting hammered. Now, a good friend of mine back in Panama City, where I grew up, who knows nothing about biology, he's like, well, shouldn't these invasions be welcome because don't they increase biodiversity? And that's a theme I've heard a lot from a lot of people who sort of aren't like sort of resource oriented. But these invasives always usually have problems associated with them, that they're excellent bullies. They usually outcompete species with similar ecological traits. That's true for plants, or especially for animals. They can change predator-prey relationships, host disease dynamics, or host parasite equilibriums. This because they themselves have escaped from their enemies in their home range, or they have some sort of novel weapon, like say, imagine a plant that exudes some chemical in the soil that just none of our natives are tolerant to growing against. Or they can alter ecosystem processes like increase the fire intensity or the frequency of the fire return interval. They affect nutrient cycling. This is especially true for Melaleuca in Everglades ecosystems. Or they affect hydrologic regimes, probably like say hydrilla in native waterways. And like a really bad example of this is the extinction of rare plants or animals when these invaders can drive other natives extinct. And a good example of this is the brown tree snake on Guam. It was introduced to Guam in 1950, most likely on a US military flight. This snake loves to eat birds, eggs and birds. And Guam has a whole bunch of endemic birds that never had a snake predator they evolved with. So they don't have defenses against snake predation. This Marianas fruit dove, it is extinct. It is no longer with us. This Micronesian Myzomela is extinct in the wild. It's only alive in captive breeding programs. The Guam rail. A lot of these birds are, I should say, are ground nesters too. So that's part of why they're so hammered by this snake. The Guam rail is extinct in the wild. The rufous fantail bird, the Guam subspecies, is extinct. There's other subspecies bird that live on nearby islands, but this subspecies is extinct. The Micronesian kingfisher is extinct in the wild on Guam. This species does occur on other islands in the area, but it is extinct on Guam right now. 5 other bird species were driven extinct by 1987. So was that like 37 years? It's driven several birds extinct. 2 other endemic bird species have less than 200 individuals left. We're now starting to see long-term indirect effects of that brown tree snake here. Notice that cobweb back here, super thick, all these spiders hanging out. This snake has driven so many of the birds extinct or reduced their number so much that there's a lot less birds to eat spiders. And there's parts of the rainforest on Guam that are completely canopied over by cobweb because there's nothing there to control the spiders. And it's actually changing the microclimate in that sort of tropical forest system. There's like weird disease outbreaks of fungus and stuff due to the change in microclimate. And to think that one snake could have such profound effects on the ecosystem, does this snake problem sound familiar to you Floridians? Well, it should. We have the severe effects of the Burmese python in South Florida on small mammals. In the southern part of the Everglades National Park, Everglades marsh rabbit, I don't think the animal or droppings have been observed in 20 years, if I recall the fact right. I think that might include cottontail too. And I think these are barely noticeable in the northern part of the park. Gray fox, raccoon, and possum have had somewhere between 93 to 98% declines in observances where the Burmese python is rampant. This is also a neat graphic. I cannot for the life of me remember who made this, but this is the typical, or I shouldn't say typical, it's sort of like what you could call like the average diet of a Burmese hatchling, what a hatchling eats to achieve, I think, some length in 1 year of growth or something like that, or maybe to achieve its full size. You gotta remember you're talking to a botanist here. I don't remember the exact detail, but the thing that the idea that one snake has this impact in its lifetime is just horrific. All right. I really want to talk about, I guess, the most severe effect of non-natives are the what I call ecosystem engineers, and I'm going to just really restrict it to plants in this case. You have both punk tree in South Florida and Chinese tallow in North Florida taking unforested ecosystems and converting them to complete monoculture forested ecosystems without any management. This is especially problematic in Louisiana and Texas for Chinese tallow. And many of you are familiar with the effects of Melaleuca in South Florida on unmanaged lands, on private properties that aren't managed. Same thing with Brazilian pepper. It can get a foothold in unforested areas, especially where you have a natural hammock in an unforested adjacent habitat. That pepper loves to ring that hammock, completely crowd out, and then it punches back out and builds into the unforested habitat. Likewise, the Brazilian pepper punches into the hammock and will basically create a monoculture in a few decades without any management. Old world climbing fern can present the opposite problem. We have a natural tree island here inside Everglades National Park. And over time, without any management, say like might be occurring on, say, big cattle property or just big ag land, without any management, that climbing fern will slowly kill that tree island over time. by shading the trees out or holding on to a lot of rain because of the increased surface area of all that foliage. In a tropical storm event, it can just topple the trees because the tree trunks aren't designed to hold all that weight from that extra weight of the fern with that tremendous surface area, seeing the foliage holding on to all that rain with winds twisting it. It's a scenario to lose your trees over time. Same happens with Kogan grass. Gets a foothold in fire dependent ecosystem, and it really increases the fire severity such that you will burn out your pines over time, probably due to below ground competition from the extensive root system and the torching of the canopies due to the flame lengths. Air potato will completely eradicate your hammock in a couple of decades due to its abundant foliage. I've got a little clip here. I'm not going to play it. It's just a static still, but this is a neat little video from Stephen Brown, extension agent down in Lee County. Just Google Stephen Brown air potato on YouTube. It is a hilarious video showing, just highlighting the problem with air potato. It's one of the funny invasive plant educational videos. I always recommend people go Google. Also, some of the land management actions you have to take actually can help promote invasive species. I shouldn't say that you have to do, but the properties that you might be managing, recreation or other activities can occur that help promote the spread of invasives, like, for instance, recreating on water bodies in Florida and the possible movement of hydrilla from one lake to another or from one creek system to another. Likewise, here's a hiker hiking on a trail. If you got a bunch of Caesar weed lining either side of this trail, the hiker potentially could move some seeds around, but you can't exclude your property from hiking. That's just not possible. This is really going to be problematic with horse traffic, because horse traffic or equestrian trails, definitely you'll see movement of Caesar weed along it, because horses are so good about picking up those seeds with their swishing tail and the seeds falling off further down the trail. Agriculture on managed lands can cause invasive spread. If you have property that's overgrazed, this is cheatgrass out west. If you overgraze this, or if it's overgrazed, cheatgrass loves this because the cattle just pretty much will not eat it unless they're starving. And that reduced competition allows cheatgrass to just rampantly spread. Here's someone who went hiking through cheatgrass and noticed the seeds clinging to the socks and shoes, so they probably stick to cattle legs too to some extent. Here's someone trying to do some aquaculture in a pond over here, but maybe because of high nutrient loading, they've got a whole bunch of that giant salvinia here on top. So, you know, trying to convert a water body to, say, an ag use can feed back into creating something that allows an invasive to get a foothold easy. Agriculture can actually promote evolutionary change in non-native species. For instance, sorghum grown here in the front for molasses production and sorghum flour. A close relative is Johnson grass, but there's been such selection to treat Johnson grass either by hand pulling in other countries or, you know, herbicides, say here in Canada, that Johnson grass is starting to have cultivars evolve to look more like sorghum. So now they're getting harder to tell apart. Likewise, overseas where rice has been domesticated for thousands of years, barnyard grass, Echina cloa, has been hand pulled for centuries, if not, yeah, actually millennia. And now there's variants of barnyard grass that are starting to mimic rice in appearance because of evolutionary selection pressure to get rid of the plants that don't look like rice. Also, canola, grown for canola oil. There was genetic modification made by Monsanto to resist Roundup. But as many botanists know, these brassica species can readily interbreed, and the Roundup resistant gene in canola hopped into a close relative, this Brassica rapa. It's just generic like yellow mustard. This is a common roadside weed in the northern US, and it is now resistant to Roundup. So now you're getting local DOT, like county DOT groups having to spray, say, like imazapyr to treat this plant. You know, can you imagine, just imagine like miles of roadside being sprayed with imazapyr to treat this plant. And quickly, I want to talk about some cryptic invasion. This common reed, Phragmites australis, is native to a whole bunch of the world. Like everything you see in gray is like the native range of some variant of this. And this is our native congener here. But notice this European genotype that's been introduced, how it's much taller, it's darker green. The seed heads are actually like a lot thicker too, like a more robust flower and seed head versus these more wispy things here. And that's because some, I think, tetraploid cultivar from the Mediterranean region got over here, and now it's spreading in the US. And it's this European genotype that's causing problems here in North America. All right, just to quickly summarize, Florida's got more, well, I shouldn't say summarize, I never mentioned this earlier, but Florida does have more non-native plant species than any other continental US state except for California. And most of those non-native plant species don't cause any problems here in Florida, but about 10% are ecologically damaging, at least potentially are. And those effects can vary from none to severe. Some of these might be so severe that the degraded ecosystems may not actually be able to be restored to the original ecosystem that they were. Activities outside and within these managed natural areas may exacerbate invasive species, as well as the invasives themselves impacting the land management actions that can be taken on. And invasions may be occurring without our immediate knowledge. Again, referencing those cryptic invasions there. All right, I just want to thank my cohorts here at FNA, and also for the invasive plant management section of FWC, what I call Linda King's posse. Definitely, I want to thank IFAS folks for providing us lots of content for these presentations. And lastly, I want to thank all you folks out there just managing land and resources who have too much to do with too little money and too little time, because I was in that boat once myself, and I know what a chore that is. And I just thank you all for the work you do. All right, so I think I'm going to end my screen sharing here. Oh, okay. All right, and I see we're running a little behind. So Kim, I think you're up next with the Botany 101.
Okay, let's see. I can bring up my screen. There we go.